Welcome back to Rockers Beer Review. Today we're going to do a ranking of the Norwegian synth pop band a-ha, founded in 1982 by Paul Waaktaar-Savoy on guitars and vocals and Magna Verholum on guitars, keyboards and vocals, and Morten Harket, of course, on lead vocals. So what's the background of this great band? Well, they hit the big time in the 80s, but they've actually had 11 albums across the last 5 decades. The first in 85, the recent in 2022. And they're not just a one-hit wonder. You know, people think about Take On Me, but they've actually sold 100 million albums and actually hold the Guinness World Record for having the biggest paying rock concert attendance. They drew an audience of 198,000 at the Macarena Stadium during the Rock in Rio festival. So, let's do the ranking of albums, order from number 11 to number 1. In 11th position is their latest album, True North. We'll start with a bit of a theme that we'll see developed across these albums. a-ha seem to like to open a lot of their albums with quite slow ballads, which to some extent goes against the grain of most artists. True North is no different, but like quite a few albums, it sort of sets the scene with this, and it sort of never gets going. Yes, it's cinematic and it has the usual sort of a-ha melancholy, but sometimes you need a hook, and it never really comes. True North, the song itself, is a beautiful track, but overall the album is about as warming as a cold winter night in Oslo. It's their last album, and it's a million miles from their early 80s output. Soundbite for this album: too many ballads. In 10th position is the album Foot of the Mountain. Now, after I heard the title track, the first single, I had high hopes for this album. But unfortunately, with the exception of maybe the opener track, Bandstand, keyboards are really up front in this album and centre across the whole of it. And it's quite different to most of the modern albums, really. So it only makes 10th position. In 9th position is Analog. Now, for some reason, when you listen to this album on Spotify, the tracks are slightly different than, or even just removed compared to the album I had on CD. So, opener Salice isn't on the Spotify album, nor is Cozy Prisons, or even the title track itself, which is a bit of a shame because, in my opinion, these 3 tracks are probably the best 3 songs on the album. The only other standout is probably the quite upbeat Don't Do Me Any Favours. It's a good album, but it's got more misses than hits. And if you listen on Spotify, then you'll find it even more disappointing. In 8th position is Cast in Steel. Now, when you listen to this album, you wonder whether it's actually with friends at the orchestra, as it were. It sounds like they've hired a big orchestra for this album, and I think they definitely have, certainly on a lot of number of tracks. The first 2 tracks are almost overly laden with strings, and then again, never quite sure why a-ha starts their albums with slower songs. It just never makes sense to me. The songs on this album, though, are well put together, if sometimes a little bland. The Wake, though, gets the album into gear and takes us back to the sort of 80s with its sort of synth rock sound. And then Forest Fire keeps up that 80s vibe with a keyboard-led rocker. And it's probably the standout track of the album. Although I do quite like the track Mythomania, it's also quite good. Overall, lots of great tunes, but just doesn't quite elevate it to greatness. In 7th position is the album Lifelines. Now, if this album had songs that matched the quality of the opener and title track, then it would probably be higher up on the list. It's a great pop song. It was only ruined by me personally by a Scottish friend of mine who really enjoyed it as well and used to play it on almost repeat, usually after a big session in the pub right after he returned home late in the early hours. That chorus, though, is as catchy as hell. There's other good songs on it, like You Wanted More, Did Anyone Approach You? They're pretty good songs, but it's quite a long album, and there's probably just too much filler in it. So Lifelines hits number 7 in the position. In sixth position is East of the Sun, West of the Moon. For me, this is when I sort of stopped listening to a-ha. It's just all a bit bland. Early Morning and I Call Your Name are probably the only standout tracks. Cold River is one that, well, actually it stands out as it's just a very guitar heavy, rocky sort of song, and it probably sounds quite different than anything you've probably heard from a-ha. It feels a little bit out of place for the band. Now we're hitting the better stuff. In number 5, we've got Minor Earth, Major Sky. Now, after 7 years since Memorial Beach, most of us thought that a-ha were done. But this is a real comeback album, full of intent. Certainly Opener and the title track has that real groovy electronic vibe. But then the rest of the album don't quite match up to that initial opener. Don't quite keep the intensity going. Little Black Heart is a nice ballad, but it's got little substance to it. Velvet then follows and is a bit weaker still. Summer Moved On is a much better, with its sort of heavy strings and vocal masterclass from obviously Morten Harket. And here's a fun fact for you. This song holds the European record for the longest held note in a top 40 song. 20.2 seconds to be exact. My favourite track though is probably the rockier, more upbeat The Sun Never Shone That Day. It's a great track and probably the highlight from the album. It's not a bad album, but again, maybe has a few more misses in there. In fourth position though is Memorial Beach. For me, it's an underrated album. This is a-ha when they're going on full on U2 really. Fortunately though, it seems to be more influenced by probably the best U2 album, Uptown Baby, which came out just a few years earlier than this album. Dark is the Night of All and Angel of the Snow especially so, got a real U2 vibe. But other great tracks are the more funky Move to Memphis, and my favourite track on the album is the 8-minute epic Cold as Stone. It's a much more laid back, reflective album. Title track especially shows that they weren't trying to make, 3-minute pop songs anymore. So Memorial Beach stays in fourth position. In third position is Stay on These Roads. This is actually their third album. It sounds a bit bigger than the previous two, but by now it's starting to come across almost as a bit more corporate pop rock. There's still some great songs on it. Opener title track is good enough, but again, having a ballad open an album is never a good thing. The Blood That Moves the Body is much better and has more of a funky bass line. Touchy, I remember when it came out at the time, it was not a song that many people liked. It was a bit diversive of sort of a-ha's style at the time. Again, sounds a bit out of place, but listening to it back now, it's a fun diversion from the usual sort of Scandinavian melancholy that they're known for. For me though, the best track has to be the Bond song, The Living Daylights. For me, it's a classic a-ha, and it's one of probably the better James Bond theme songs. And when you think of some of the great tracks that we've had for Bond theme tunes, that's high praise indeed. So this album gets third position. In second position is their debut, Hunting High and Low. It could easily hit number 2 spot on the weight of the two big singles, Take On Me obviously, and The Sun Always Shines on TV, which I think is a superior song. But there's a little bit more complexity to probably one of my favourite a-ha songs, the title track, Hunting High and Low. It isn't all pure pop though. You have Living a Boy's Adventure Tale, a kind of Smith sounding song with Morten Harket channeling his best Morrissey impression. And there's an impressive falsetto in this song. Even the sort of very, early for the time, Stott Aiken and Waterman sounding Love Is Reason could have been sung by Rick Astley. Still sounds great, if a little bit too poppy for the hardened rocker like me. But I Dream Myself Alive is similar, but has a bit more of that Scandi melancholy to make it a trademark a-ha pop song. But overall, this is a very, very good album, but just about only makes number 2 position. First position, this was easy for me because I think it's a cracking album, Scoundrel Days. This album, the second album, is more rock than pop. I think it's a really great follow-up to Hunting High and Low. You've got actual drums this time, but also some really great songs. Title track, wow, really incredible. I've Been Losing You, Manhattan Skyline, Cry Wolf, The Weight of the Wind. They're all top draw tracks. And this album doesn't suffer that difficult second album syndrome, but takes everything good about their debut and just makes it better. Sounds have more identity and the instruments have a bit more space to really sort of jump out. You can hear the drums, you can hear bass and guitars. It's not all sort of keyboard and synths and drum machines. I think Morton is singing probably the best he ever has. But more importantly though, when I listen to it now, it still sounds as fresh in 2024 as it did in 1986. But what a year that was for music. As I was hitting my teens, you had this album, you had The Colour of Spring by Talk Talk, Invisible Touch by Genesis, So by Peter Gabriel, and even stuff like Dancing on the Ceiling by Lionel Richie were really incredible pop albums of 1986. But there was massive rock albums by some of the big artists as well. Let's face it, 5150 by Van Halen came out in this year, Slippery When Wet by Bon Jovi, and even The Final Countdown by Europe. But there's my ranking of the 11 albums by a-ha. Let me know what you think. Any albums there you'd want to move higher or lower? Let me know in the comments what your favourite a-ha album is. I'm really interested to know. And yeah, it might be a bit unusual for me to do a ranking of a very sort of known as a pop band, when a lot of my stuff is much more heavier and much more in the hard rock, heavy metal and progressive rock music. But I thought this was a good little diversion from the usual rock stuff, and shows, you know, this is a sort of band that I was a massive fan of. They're probably one of my favourite bands of the 1980s, and I think, you know, they deserve more love. So let me know what you think of a-ha in the comments. And until the next one, well, you know what you got to do. Keep on rocking.